Hello. So I wanted to share with you the second lecture series I did at the Bangor Design Conference back in 2018. And even though that was quite a way ago, I still feel that even in 2020, I'm still getting asked very, very similar questions from undergraduates and recent graduates about essentially sort of how do they take that first step with their career? How do they sort of overcome some of the fears or insecurities or doubts, be them just in their head or actually real world issues that you've got to find a way to navigate through in terms of getting a job. And so I hope this is a sort of combination of sharing a different story to the 2017 one, of the design process, getting into some of the stuff I did with Big Life Fix, and a slightly more sort of behind the scenes sort of way than is necessarily just on the TV. So I hope I'm not giving anything too much away, but I think it's always fun to show the mistakes and the errors, not just the clean narrative arc that comes through on TV. So, and again, the latter part, I wanted to get into a little bit, breaking down how to sort of compile what I think is maybe a good folio structure for applying for jobs, but then also not to overlook some of the things which I think are actually critical, even though far less sexy, of the cover letter and knowing really why your CV needs to be tailored. It's something you hear all the time as a student, and it becomes a chore, and you think, well, how do I make it tailored? I've written this a million times for different companies. How does it stay fresh and individual? So I'm hoping to shed a little bit of light on that and share some of my experiences, hopefully with the benefit of hindsight of working at companies like Dyson, Lego, and startups like Subaru, and obviously mentioned a little bit at the BBC. So I wouldn't say I was the typical product design engineer, but it's something that maybe gives you guys latitude to make it your own and do whatever you want. Okay, so here we go. So yeah, this was all about the sort of, as the tutors said, there was a phrase. So when I was asking them, what do you think the students would want from the previous year, and they said, oh, they're just a bit struggling to know how to take that first leap and push the button. And I just loved, probably a bit, the Chemical Brothers, but also just loved that phrase. So this was sort of how to push the button, and I was trying to get into the mindset of what I was like as a student back then. So this isn't a critique of Bangor students. This is my internal fears as well when I was back in 2009. And you know, if I push the button, I might realize that it confirms that I probably suck as a student, but it was saying I might not, and that I'll grow through doing it. Whereas if you don't push the button, you definitely won't suck publicly, but nobody cares about what you do either. So there is a certain bit of do or die that needs to be done. And it's okay if no one cares. But it was a warning from a good friend of mine who, before being a friend, I completely idolized and thought was just a huge inspiration of someone who's really managed to sort of forge a very unique and individual career whilst retaining, I think, a huge amount of integrity and humor and just really doing breathtaking work. So please check out his stuff. And indeed, you know, if it's in America, forgive the cuss words, but I think it's worth it. He said, talk minus action equals shit. And I just think that's a hell of an acid test if you call yourself a design student. And I think the way I internalize that is, all right, so I wrote a so many thousand word essay. I did a bunch of CAD rendering. I photoshopped in some people looking smiley and happy. Maybe a few for sort of inclusivity and gender and diversity. And then I pretended like it was job done. Is that really good enough? Or did I go out there and I tested it with people and I watched it fail and then went back to the drawing board and figured out what to do next? And even though it will feel less sexy and less comfortable, that is by far the better way to do it. Not for any other reason than quite simply that is what your employer will be looking for. And even if you are going to be self-employed, that is what your end client or your end user is going to demand, that you've done that time. It's quite unlikely that you'll just roll out of bed and nail it first time. And I can't really think of any examples. Feel free to throw them in the comment where that has ever happened. So it's always about the grind. It's always about the action, not the talk. Although talk helps. I'm here talking to you, so forgive me. So anyway, what I was going to basically go through in this is sort of messy career paths are okay, bit of background into Big Life Fix, creating digital playgrounds for a young boy who was blind, and also feedback on folios, CVs, interviews, how to sort of understand that, and questions below. That would be sensible. So there we go. In the beginning, for those of you who don't know, I love this photo just because there's, for me, a bit of irony that I ended up doing a website on cardboard modelling and plastic and foam as well, but nonetheless, cardboard featured heavily. And certainly at age 10 or whatever it was, I never believed that this would sort of be almost like the beginnings of something that I could actually draw an income from. So this was with me, with one of my friends, making what is a T-Rex in our heads out of cardboard boxes. And then 22 years later, probably a bit more than that now, but nonetheless, I ended up going into all these different fields. And as you can see, going through them very, very quickly. That was sort of like motor design and aeroacoustic design at Dyson, working with the NHS in my final year project, whiskey packaging, putting a Superman doll up into the edge of space, messing around with nature, cardboard modelling at Dyson obviously featured heavily. Ended up working at Lego, ran an R&D team at 12 at Sugru. I've since become a dad and made all sorts of silly little things for my son. Always still love the engineering. I'm not actually a very great sketcher, but I'm quick, and I think there's a little bit of a trade-off with that, which works in my favour. And also just, I think, often you end up sort of pitching yourself as an engineer as a technical person, but I've always loved the sort of renaissance and the art and that sort of breadth of things. So I'd actually done ceramics to quite a high level for about 6 years alongside all of this when I was younger. And so it's something that even though I do less of now, I still have some weird experiments like this cup and a good brew. So there we go. So I wanted to just basically, forgive me if this is a repetition of the first one, feel free to skip ahead. But I basically was just putting down my CV of all the things I ended up doing. And that's all well and good. And I've since moved on to being a freelance technologist and prototyping expert from Lego. But essentially what I wanted to communicate to a lot of students is this sounds all very glitzy, but really it was one of those things where if I show the bumps, it actually becomes a little bit more interesting and a bit more nuanced, in that I graduated as a chemist. I didn't just go straight to product design engineering, and I faffed around being a butcher, statistician, horticultural specialist, and it all going a little bit wrong. So I retrained after seeing Seymour and Powell's Better by Design series and thinking that the prospect of retraining looks less painful than actually going back into it. And oddly enough, I seem to be closing down on the student loan, I just realised. So again, even having 2 student loans is not necessarily terrible if you're earning money because you're doing what you love. So there's a bit of a unique thing that you don't have to come from a rich family to do 2 degrees. You can just take the hit on the loans, and then certainly in the UK the system is fantastic. Not so easy in America, but maybe things will change, eh? So again, I was assessed for dyslexia quite late into my second degree, which I think helped me, not necessarily, I hope, not just sort of have an excuse, but actually it sort of allowed me to sort of reframe, a bit more aggressively what I was and wasn't good at. So in some ways it meant I just stopped trying to do certain things because I knew it never did feel easy, and I focused on the things that I did well. And dare I say, I think that helped push me more into sort of physical prototyping and things like this, and visualization in design. So I also failed at licensing my final year project with the NHS. To cut a long story short, the thing that I feel was actually quite admirable is that I went around all these big pharma companies, and a few of them, took me aside and said, look, off the record, you have to take this in good faith. Your device is terrific, but it only saves, about at best it'll save a couple of hundred people a year. And even though that is important and every death is a tragedy, the ultimate truth of this is that this isn't a charity, it's a business model. And it's going to take X million to bring this into market. And if it doesn't yield a considerable amount more millions than that, the numbers just don't stack up. And so it's fine if you develop something really cool and you want it to be an ethical thing, that's a charitable cause, go ahead, be a charity. But do recognise, if you're trying to sell it to a pharma industry, pharma's never been, discreet about the fact it operates very aggressive margins, and that's just how it is. So unless I set about trying to change the entire world of pharmaceuticals, which I wasn't gonna, then I had to realise that was just the truth being told to me, and to take it on the chin a little bit. So no, I didn't become a millionaire by licensing my final year project, but I did have a great time doing all these other things, and obviously working at, tech scouting at Lego was absolutely terrific, and I got to go to places like Tokyo and Tel Aviv and Berlin, do all sorts of crazy stuff, which I can't say anything about, but it was amazing, and it definitely helped me understand some of the best things in hindsight of what I love doing about prototyping and making things, and it made more sense, ultimately freelancing in the long run. So again, owning that narrative of why you would want to sort of, craft your own journey. I never realized at the time being chemist would lead really well to doing an R&D team at Sugru, which is a chemical engineering company in terms of R&D. And similarly, the butchers, all that knife skills helped me go to design modeling, and that was just really terrific in terms of realizing how I was taught by really good butchers, and then that helped me teach people how to use knives safely. And similarly, I had a really weird situation where I ended up leading the R&D team at Sugru, and that was great. But I got a friend who I had done a workshop in Berlin for on design modeling, who called up and said, "Hey, Lego had someone dropped out of a presentation series. They need someone who can get on a plane and put together a presentation in 48 hours. Can you do it?" I said yes without really thinking about it, but I had a blast. I stayed in Lego's memory of some people enough that I ended up getting a call to be a technology scout. So I'd always say at the beginning of your career, for sure, and as much as you can with other family commitments or whatever, saying yes to some of these unique things is always worked out well for me, even if you don't know when. So I think, again, a sort of honest truth is that messy is normal, and tell the story afterwards. I had a bit of a saying with, the team in R&D, of that when we'd had a really bad day of the research and the experiments all going wrong, sometimes things breaking at huge cost. I always said, well, this is terrible now, but it'll be a really good story down the pub in a few months' time. And I kind of think trying to keep that perspective, if you haven't killed anyone or poisoned ecosystem, then, how bad is it if you just messed up a bit of a manufacturing thing and it set you back a couple of days? It's not that bad. So that sort of resilience, I think, helped me sort of take a jump and go, well, BBC Two's Big Life Fix is a really unusual challenge where, you don't know whether you're going to succeed in helping people with all these various disabilities through design and technology. And this genuinely wasn't a thing where we knew what we were going to do on day one and then we faked it for the camera. This was absolutely terrifying, that you went, I'm being filmed and it might not work at all, and I'm going to be the guy who didn't get it together at the end. So it was really quite scary. It's quite daunting, but fortunately it seemed that everyone managed to get something that worked together. And I got to say, it was just absolutely incredible working with all these other designers and engineers, and some were my friends before, but absolutely love all the guys now. It's been a huge privilege to do something like that. So again, take those opportunities, even if it means having to run them alongside your full-time job in your evenings and weekends, as I did. So, and we also did a children needs special, which again was terrific. So the thing that, the best bit of being a designer, I think, is that you have to solve a real problem. And this was a young chap, Josh, who's blind, and he was really struggling to sort of basically navigate the playground and hence play with his friends. Because if you can't get to the place where the action is, it's really hard to feel included in the games. And it's not to say that all games are about running around in a crazy, direction. Sometimes it was people just sitting down, but he wasn't able to get there in time and be part of it and included. So it was just incredibly frustrating. But I've also got a little video about this, but safe to say, you can appreciate you're watching this on YouTube, so I'm not going to breach the copyright of BBC. Please click in the link below, go watch it, and come back. And so pause this. Cool. So I wanted to get into a little bit the design process of helping Josh and his family. And I think as much as, I'm incredibly proud of it, I know that quite often it looks, when you've edited something, it looks very clean. And I wanted to almost show a little bit the sweat and the grind that Ruby and myself went through on this. So needless to say, many post-it notes were used in this process of really trying to document about as much as we could about Josh's life and really get into the detail of that, not just with him, his mum, his dad, his key workers, his teachers, and of course his friends at school, as well as then analysing the environment. And so, as you can see, we take pictures of some of it, but a lot of it was also just, continual discussion and observation. And I think there really is no shortcut for this. And I think dare I say it, it's one of those things to really brace yourself for as you go out into the world as a graduate, that the more efficient you can be with having good techniques of how to explore the design process at the beginning, the better. Because the truth is, when you're on a project, that is the bit that is always squished. You always get far too little time to do endless design research, ethnographic studies, user surveys, all that stuff. So the ability to make some quick judgments on if you'd love to do 10 things and you only have time to do 3, which are going to be the most effective and powerful things to do research on or get data on, only experience will tell you that on case by case. So I'd really say this is the bit on your folio. Don't sort of skim over the fact that even the wrong turns and the red herrings are sometimes exactly what an employer is looking for. Certainly in my case, that was exactly what I was looking for, is how do you adjust when something isn't what you thought it was, or your hypothesis was wrong. So I couldn't say it strongly enough, double down on that. So concept 1 that we came up with, geo-positioning, beacons and an app. And concept 2, we were thinking capacitive touchboards. And so I don't know if you can see these little pads here. We were thinking if someone steps on them, that basically that would help them navigate, and maybe a speaker would tell them to turn left or turn right. I think when we're honest about it, it was just one of those things that sounded good on paper and it just wasn't working with the capacitive touch, and some more on the subtlety of that later. So on the cutting room floor, those were the 2 things which were sort of shown in the example. But actually there was a load of other sillier stuff that we looked at. So for example, retro reflecting fiducials. So these are the things that are on the moon that they fire lasers at, and they have all these little mirrors, a bit like in the back of your reflectors on your bike or on a car. And then they send the beam back to Earth. And we were thinking, oh, Josh could just wear a hat, and then we could track him with all these thousands of pounds worth of technology. And again, I'm sharing this not because we spent weeks crafting it, but just it was a post-it note on the wall that we said, well, what if we do it that way? It is a way you could do it. It just isn't a good way to do it, because why would Josh want to wear a stupid helmet all day? And is that system really going to be reliable in all weathers? Probably not. We also mentioned, what happens if we track all the kids? So this didn't make the edit, but we did actually do it. And this is the data set for tracking probably close to 100 kids with vests on that had GPS tracking, and them just having a break time. And so it's just chaos. And how the hell could you process that data accurately? Because even GPS has a little bit of error in it. And so it's completely inappropriate to give that data to Josh and then be like, on you go. He's not going to navigate that even with the best user interface in the world. Again, sometimes you end up putting yourself in a position. I say I learned this a little bit from Dyson, that Dyson you could criticize because sometimes they truly do seem to reinvent the wheel, but in the process learn something different about inventing the wheel. And sometimes that's actually quite valuable. So the conventional wisdom at the time was that we had these little Bluetooth beacons, which are about this big and maybe that thick. And what's interesting about those is when you put them on the ground, the picture on the left, they have a beam that goes out for about plus or minus 3 meters. So Josh would only know where he is relative to, say, a tree or a bench or a sandpit plus or minus 3 meters, which is as good as not knowing where you are. And what we realized is that by putting it in a hole, it focused the beam. So this hole, we put, steel tubing, just a chunk of, like scaffolding pole, and sunk it in, and it attenuated and focused the beam. And what was weird is that we actually got it down to plus or minus 2.5 meters. And so that's kind of getting into the sort of realm of being useful. It means that, that there was an accuracy of half a meter, about this much, of Josh being close to the target, which is completely legitimate for a lot of things. However, the reason we didn't go for that is because ultimately it was still very much, Josh was having to do the heavy lifting on his environment, and it was becoming very technical. But if we just stuck with the professional, knowledge, we just would have been left with the stat on the left, which is that the beacon isn't suitable, and we wouldn't have figured out that actually we could focus the beam with essentially a chunk of pipe, which is pretty cheap. So I do think it's one of those things you just don't know till you get into it. But I'm also not saying don't read the textbooks and speak to the experts as well, but know when to shift gears between the two. And that only comes with experience, I'm not going to lie. And there's plenty of times when you get it wrong. But anyway, so I put in, wait, what did you say? Big Life Fix Beam Technology, like on £1,000 budget with no prior experience of RF, radio frequency stuff in a few weeks using some scaffold poles and concrete. Yeah, sure. So I kind of felt that was just one of those things where no one would have taken it seriously if it was a proposal. But the fact we actually did it was kind of cool. So we improved the technology a bit, but I'm not in any way saying we've transformed low energy Bluetooth overnight. But it's just interesting as a finding. So again, it was really about sort of taking risks and sort of having a go at things. So I ended up having a really weird conversation with this chap, David Engelman. And what's extraordinary about it is that he had done some work where he had taken a vest which was covered in all these little vibration motors like you get in your mobile phone. And he had written some clever bit of code which took a microphone, it listened to you say something like hello, and then it created a unique code of vibrations that were all over your body. And that essentially was the body had a chance to learn that. And then it would learn, say, 20 other words. And what was incredible is that after about a week, your body was able to learn about 20 different words through the vibrational pattern. And so obviously they get more and more nuanced and intricate for more complex words. But his fundamental principle is that you could have someone who is deaf, who is able to feel an appropriate, response to a word and identify the word of what someone was saying. So hello is obviously a bit easy because I'm probably doing that as well. But this was useful for sort of less obvious things like apple or banana. And I think that's just absolutely extraordinary. And he was almost creating a sort of form of sonar. And so I've always found this world of neuroplasticity very, very interesting. But of course, you can appreciate we're getting into a very complex world of saying, okay, if you take this, as I'm showing here, converting it into a signal, you've got all that. We were wondering, okay, the bandwidth of saying hello and converting it into a signal, if you look at what an image is, it's incredibly complex. It's orders of magnitude more complex. So we have a bandwidth issue on what, how many megabytes per second the data, your skin can handle. What's the bandwidth of your skin? And so I realized that this was just completely crazy. It would never happen, so we didn't even test it. But we thought what was interesting is that with a lot of the new technology around, Microsoft Connect, SLAM and things like this, and all the sort of, driverless car technology, when you look at an image, it doesn't draw everything like a JPEG, like a picture. It looks at things in terms of vector and line art. So it would just see a tree and see a doorway or something here. And that's that's a much, much less intense bit of information. So the hypothesis was, instead of trying to feed through Josh's skin a JPEG, could we feed a vector graphic with some specific words to replace all that complexity? So is there bandwidth for different parts of the body? I ended up reading around books like Touch by David Linden, and sort of thinking, which are the best places to do it. There's no point putting it on his hands, even though they're terrific for these sorts of things. But the problem is you're then not freeing up his hands to do other stuff. You're not going to do his face. So again, it leaves sort of back and arms, which is not great, actually, as it turns out. So we were thinking, okay, the camera for augmented reality into a system, and he senses the image. Could his body learn this? And essentially, we got into it, and it was interesting. And we wondered whether we're taking something from megabytes per second to kilobytes per second by simplifying it. Can we then overlay things like 1 meter, 2 meter, 5 meters, buildings, trees, and an edge of something? And indeed, it's actually not too difficult to sort of recognize faces. So we could even say you're standing next to Shane. But even though we were getting into sort of this thing of augmenting Josh and putting him in all these haptic suits, should we be really doing that, or adjusting his environment? And I think that was like the bit that I hope you'll forgive. This is not a criticism of the BBC or the editors. This is just such a long journey, and the audience would need so much time to get up to speed on why this wasn't a good solution. You can appreciate it just didn't make the edit. But this was the journey that Ruby and I took, of getting to this point of thinking, right, we could do this, but it's still the overriding thing is augment the environment, not Josh. So that was the big learning, I think, that we took. And I think if we'd always been worried about the cameras, we never would have done it. And I think a little bit of it was letting go of that fear and taking the risks. So you could say that it was 3 months that were wasted, and they never made the edit. But I think in some ways, we still spoke with, David Engelman, which was terrific. And, it really made me reevaluate my entire outlook on human-machine interactions, which I'm pretty certain influenced a lot of my work at Lego without giving anything specific. But just that ability of what is critical in these things. So, so I think in many ways it was sort of around not trying to make Josh into a cyborg. We were sort of saying, okay, how do we do this a better way? So back to the drawing board, keep it simple, stupid, as you often get told in your engineering mentors. So we revisited this thing of capacitive, and so it was good, but the technology needed improving. So we looked at, could we make a force-sensitive resistor that would essentially switch the pad on and off? Now the problem is, this is to scale. These things are pretty tiny. That's like 1.5 inches wide, the biggest one you can get commercially. And so we thought, well, Ross had this great idea of what if we essentially make them ourselves. And he'd already done a bit of playing around with this in previous work. And so we thought, okay, well, how about making a sort of DIY force-sensitive resistor? And so this is me playing around with some of the recommendations from Ross and all sorts of Arduino fun and games to tune it so that the resistance was just right. And this is, at the time, we just had a baby, and I was putting essentially DIY tarmac and concrete in our back garden, and then laying these things down and then spraying them with hose pipes. And it was midsummer, so they were also getting a good baking. And it was all that sort of testing to say, is this going to cope with the elements? And again, recruiting, people from, all sorts of universities. And so again, this was great. This was a chap called DJ, who came down from Royal College of Art and was just like, yeah, sure, I'll help do the grind on builds and prototypes with you. And so I think that, we wouldn't have got anywhere without him and other people like Sam, who I'll show later as well. So this was sort of me laying out all the sort of computer stuff. All of these were like little, essentially a combination of a thing that managed the input from the stepping on the pad to then playing a sound for Josh. All sorts of stuff. I'm not an electronics engineer, so this was me being schooled by Sam. And there's Sam, who I was mentioning, absolute legend, for helping do a whole bunch of the coding on this. And then I was basically tasked with building the whole thing so that it would all work together and not blow up under the stairs in the school. So again, another part of this project, I think this is sort of, one of the nicest quotes we had from the Telegraph on the series was an example of TV making itself useful. And I think to decode that a little bit, you can't often just phone up the company that built the Shard in London and said, could you basically help us dig up a playground and install this? And it's because it's TV that companies like Mace were just absolutely incredible and helped us do this. So this was our sort of like non-engineering sketch, which we gave to some confused-looking contractors, and they obviously turned it into reality. So thanks again to Mace. Ridiculous, probably miles of cable that it went in. But again, trying to keep it simple as much as possible for them with the design, but considerable amount of work going into it, as you saw from the video. And so there we have the hubs, and I think what was so great about them is I don't think it was sort of shown in the video or the program much because it was getting a bit detailed. But essentially, as kids were playing around this, you had this great opportunity for a game where if they stood on the odd roads, it would play one sound, or the even roads, it'd be another. But then if these two things did different things, you'd unlock almost like a bit like in old computer games like Street Fighter, sort of combo moves, and so you would unlock different games and sounds. And so what was terrific is, as you can see, Josh is there in the bottom left-hand corner. He's still using his cane, and honestly, it wasn't even the same day. It was within the same hour. He had already dropped the cane and just went freestyle. And so I think that was just extraordinary for his family to see, and his friends and teachers, him just start to take those leaps. So it was incredible, and having something that was as exciting for Josh to play as opposed to having a special disabled kids only zone, which would have just been really excluding, and I think Josh would have probably hated it. I think as Josh was still, fortunate enough that he was able-bodied in many other things, but limited in sight, this was something that we really were striving to do, is not over-stigmatize it. And so we love the fact that the kids were having as much fun as Josh was. So anyway, any questions? Thanks very much for listening. As I said, I hope it's useful. Please do put any questions below. And also, I guess the last part that I wanted to get onto was this thing around, which course, what do you want to do? And so this whole section on CV, folio, cover letters. So I sort of wanted to break it down. Forgive me if this is sort of a bit of a weird, love of Devil Wears Prada. But, the whole relationship of, it seeming very intimidating and how to get a job. And I think it's worth just sometimes sort of breaking down a little bit who's reading your folio and who's reading your CV. And I think it's just worth acknowledging that quite often when I look back at myself, I thought the same person was just reading everything. But I think in truth, HR are paying a lot of attention to your CV, but arguably less attention to the folio because they're not the practitioner. And so, they're going to be really annoyed by any sort of typos or, waffle or, sort of gross exaggeration. And so I think in some ways it's okay if your CV is a little bit more plain and straightforward, and then go crazy and go virtuoso on your folio because you're impressing the designers and the engineers there. But I still think it's about, the process, showing the passion, and that you've worked through a lot of potential solutions to get to the best one. So, I think it's more about emphasizing your potential to be useful in the company rather than just all the past things. So I hope that's a useful clarification. And again, similarly with the cover letter, I think, you're trying to get into the maybe pile with the cover letter. And that's quite important. You're not trying to write an essay. Save all that stuff for the actual interview. But you do need to take the cover letter really, really seriously, because if it's just reading as in, I think I'm great, I'm so great, here's all my stuff, the truth is they want to hear, okay, a little bit of how great you are, but a lot about what you think you can offer the company that's powerful. And even if some of it is completely wrong and conjecture, it might be that you claim to offer something that they've already got hires for. It doesn't matter. It just shows that you've got awareness of what's critical to the company right now. So if you've got great ideas about helping them with artificial intelligence or helping them design some particular thing to be more appealing to an elderly audience or something, then you're still on the right track if you're saying those things, for example. So anyway, learning from others, user experience design is everywhere. I kind of wanted to sort of almost, and this isn't trying to be flippant or patronizing, but I was trying to almost like break down what a friend in graphics did for me. So I can assure you, this is not taking the mick out of you. But he said, like, when you actually look at how a newspaper works, the headline is there to get your attention. The first paragraph actually lets you know 90% of what's going on, and so you can orientate whether you want to read the rest of the article or not. And so it's not an exact summary exactly, but it's making you decide whether you're going to care to read the rest. And another thing is that they said, it's easy to be down on tabloids, but they write at a level that a 12-year-old could understand it. And at first you think, oh, am I dumbing it down? Should I use some big fancy vocabulary? But even when I was at Dyson, I think many of my bosses would say it needs to be at a smart 12-year-old's level. And I think jokingly, when I got to Lego, I mean, they're working with kids more. They were like, oh, maybe even 8-year-old, 7-year-old, And so actually, I think don't fall into the trap of making it too complex. And I'll be honest and say I'm still working on this. So the main body in the paragraph, sure, go through all of that, but be memorable about how you did something that was smart, fun, or usable. And if you can, give some stats or proof. So really, the other things are just repeating that. And yeah, there was, and in case you're wondering, this was slightly passive aggressive towards Facebook even back then. So you can make of that what you will. But nonetheless, just very clear, simple images. It's not difficult to decode at a glance. And so start simple and finish provocative. So I think that's another thing that editors are quite good at, is they're leaving a good strong finish that keeps the momentum for the reader. And so in the CV, I'd be honest and say stranger will skim read it in less than 2 minutes, and I think that's being really, really generous. So would they be able to mention the highlights of your CV and say, hey, I saw this guy Bob or Sue, they're really good and they've got this. Are you interested, to one of the senior people there? So I think if you can believe that it would translate like that, that's a good CV. So consider this almost a little bit like user-centered design testing of how effective your communication is to help with your employability. So again, how an advert works. I'm just going to do a few of these. Don't worry, I won't go for them ridiculously. But I kind of wanted to basically point out that this is, about the brand or the hook being memorable, and the strap line breaks down what it does simply. And I think when you see sort of companies like Dyson, they quite often sort of use a heavyweight stat of that this is proven to be 9 out of 10 times more effective than whatever. It's better than the rest. Whereas if you say like Apple, quite often they're sort of saying this is like a first or a unique or one of a kind experience. And so sometimes you didn't even know you needed it, but you do now. So your folio, I think it isn't dissimilar to the cover letter, but you need to make sure that you did tailor it to the company and that it doesn't feel generic. So yes, little things like putting the name on first help, but it needs to go deeper than that, of the selection and the ranking. At the end of the day, of course it should start strong, finish strong, but consider the order of things that you're presenting. And I think 10 slides are about fine. I think greater than 10, ask a friend whether it still feels interesting, and a friend who will tell you the truth. So again, process, passion, and persistence, I think, are good themes to bring out. And I think, bear in mind, this is a movie trailer. It's not, the interview is the feature film, so it doesn't have to be too long. So forgive me, this was me trying to come up with some ideas of how to sort of make it more relatable. So, the whole flirting thing of like, did you stand out in a crowd? And that when someone came over to talk to you, they loved what you're about. And then you got talking and you can't believe there's all these great layers and it's fantastic. So, it's really about saying, how can you break that down a bit in your cover letter? It's almost sort of saying like, I know this is a cringeworthy example of using it like flirting, but actually think of the person in HR. Do you use the same thing of like, do you come here often? Like, if it reads like, I was interested in applying for your job, boring. So it doesn't mean that you have to write some, crazy style of English, but I do think it's really important that you don't just use the sort of trotted out phrases. And I think, it's first and foremost, of course, it's about saying that you're good, but it's all about them first and foremost in that cover letter. And did you look beyond their PR, as I said, like Apple? It's all very well looking at Apple and saying I'm all about design and blah, blah, blah. But can you start to second guess what is Apple's big next step on their journey? I mean, speaking in 2020, with Johnny Ive's departure, I'm sure all the gorgeous lines and curves are still going to be important. But when you look at where they're investing their money in, AI and health and all these things, it would probably be wise to, engage with some of that new agenda as well as their incredible legacy of what they've done. So I think be forward looking as well as acknowledging what they've done. So again, if you're still here, then I'm glad this is still working as a metaphor. But breaking down the sort of the rom-com pattern of, the chance encounter still has to be memorable. If you bumped into someone and didn't find anything worth turning around a second time, then it failed. So, showing confidence and a little bit of vulnerability, I think, is something you always see in these rom-coms, is that they always have a bit of a mixture of the two. And so there's always something where you go, oh, they can do X, Y, and Z, but they also have this potential which needs to be unlocked. And I think without getting too much into the psychology of it, a really good mentor sees a combination of that you have potential and that you're going to be good, but they also see something in you where they go, I'm going to help them grow because I know that's missing. And so I think a little bit of vulnerability and humility, you might know why you're getting hired on that basis, but sometimes that can be a great reason and the sign of a great partnership. And I think because I've had been fortunate to have some incredible mentors, I've always looked back and think that was really generous of them. They must have seen that in me and realised they could help smooth out some of those bumps and take me to a better level. So I think painting a picture of your future together, even if it's completely wrong, as it turns out, but I think it just shows that you have the ability not just to dream about the future of products, but dream about the future of your employment relationship together is also equally valid. So the interview on your phone, again, in person or in phone, I kind of feel it's one of those things. And I kind of think it's one of those things where I went through this, thinking, oh, I shouldn't be judged on my appearance, But at the same time, I've sometimes still thought, okay, I've still got to dress a little bit sharp because there's some people in the room who put a lot of, pedigree and weight on that. And there's no point alienating those. And of course, the ones who don't, doesn't matter anyway. So I think, you can debate it all you like, but some of the conventions still are important. Did you take time to think of something interesting to ask the interviewer about the company? And I think this is such a classic thing where you can really lose the entire game of the interview when they say any questions and you go, nope, that's fine. It's just like the worst answer in the world. And even if you said, no, that's fine, I especially loved your answer and I was going to ask you about this, but you completely blew me away with that point. That's fine. But don't just say, nope, it's all good. It's not, as much as it might seem polite, it just shows you haven't mentally engaged at all. And also, it suggests as if you came in with a script, the script is satisfied, and nothing that they've said has prompted a higher level of questioning in you. So even if they did answer all your questions, you've got to be still mentally present and thinking of something that is worth asking. Or indeed, ask yourself, what should I do next? A little bit. And I've sometimes been in a situation where you say, well, based on our discussion, you've satisfied all this, blah, blah, blah. What do you think would be a good, direction for me? Because I'm unsure whether it's A or B. That is still a good question. So yeah, did you imagine what questions they were going to ask? And I think it's worth sort of saying, well, if you know your weaknesses and your strengths or some of the things that are a bit contradictory, or the company is really into something, just go through a pretend rehearsal of if you were them, what would you grill yourself on? That's an exercise really worth doing. And if you can't do it, ask one of your friends to do it with you. So, and it sounds silly, but smiling, even on the phone, I think it's crazy that people still forget this one, that if you sound really kind of have a job, it's very different than if you're upbeat. Sounds obvious. I definitely can tell the difference on the phone. So again, just summarizing that, CV is getting the attention, folio is a trailer, it's not the full movie, cover letter, it's about them first, then yourself, interview, multi-layered attraction, go deep. So, so a quick note on videos, as some of the people had asked from previous years when I was at Bangor. I think video show reels are fantastic if you've done them well, but I wouldn't put so much weight on them that they essentially overshadow doing all the work up front. So I'd say nail the CV, the folio, the cover letter, get that really good. And also the thing that's a little bit, if you're going to be really honest with yourself, when you put a ton of effort into something like a folio, it's going to have almost like a half-life of being relevant. And then if you sort of are still sending that same show reel out to companies 6 months later, you're probably going to be there going, yeah, but my opinions have changed and I've moved on. And actually that track that I think was really amazing is actually a bit dated now. Ooh, it's a bit awkward. And yet you feel reticent to just burn it and re-edit it. And so I think sometimes, unless you really have had a lot of experience or you're on a video or media course where you've got to do this, then I think, in some ways, play to your strengths, and approach it with a little bit of criticism of whether this is really helping. But I confess, this is something where, it's probably, maybe I don't excel in video show reels. So if you've got a friend who does and you can work with them, then that could be a tremendous partnership and it could look really great and it could completely get you the job. But just approach it with a little bit of humility that if your degree wasn't in video and media, maybe there's some things that are gaps in your knowledge before it's going to be amazing. So, short study on sort of video making. I think if you wanted some inspiration, these are sort of, should we say, a sort of pithy sort of review of a little bit why some of the videos and messaging exists. Everything from just trying to sort of decode it in one line. Sort of if you take sort of Apple or Dyson, it's very much I buy, therefore I am. People hope that by buying an iPad, you're somehow quite as smart or quite as dynamic as any of these leaders. And so I think, sort of Kickstarter is maybe just all about the promise of being the new, that you're someone who tries the things at the alpha or beta stage. And, it's just thinking, what is the way that you would pitch your style? And so I think with your projects, if you can't almost imagine it as a sort of Instagram or Twitter post, it's worth questioning, like, what is the narrative and can you sort of refine it or make it more efficient? So if in doubt, join forces. If marketing, graphics, copywriting, web design aren't your strength, you can definitely trade. And it's almost certain that there'll be someone, who's in graphics who'll really appreciate your, more design background. So again, putting all these things together. So I think this seemed to go quite well. So when I presented it to the students and I got some good questions and feedback of this is how I thought the folio might look. So you've got a cover page, again, personalize it. Contents, if you can, put them in a sequence that reflects and references the cover letter, at least subtly. Maybe do a project that's a really big impact, that's, maybe with an impressive company or doing something quite audacious. And then doing something that's maybe a bit longer with big process. And so really getting into the problem, the jeopardy, and this is sort of borrowing a little bit from my experience in TV of like, don't always just show it all working beautifully, show when it went wrong, and then the win, because that's the fun. That's what keeps people watching TV and it keeps people reading your folio. So again, maybe there's some opportunity for something then that you can change gear and have a sort of slightly quirky project, or something that was really quite ambitious and it maybe even failed. But you explain the learnings from it. Something that was maybe a bit intriguing or not quite resolved, and then maybe a bit of a cliffhanger where you say, I'm still working on this, and we're still testing it and it's exciting. And I think it's worth putting in voluntary and interests. I think a lot of employers deep down probably have a sort of an opinion that you have a lot of time on your hands, which may or not be true. But I think doing a bit of voluntary work will always stand you in good stead. because it will also expose you to things where you don't have the same pressures because it's not financially, scrutinized. You can sometimes do things which are a little bit more unconventional. So definitely don't discount the validity of that. So you've got your breadth, and then you've also got your depth. So it's worth sometimes saying that you don't have to make the folio big, but it's worth acknowledging that if you've shown good process, it kind of implies that you've got it in the other project as well, but definitely nail it on one. And it's worth sort of saying sometimes the voluntary and the icebreaker, when you speak to some of the people in HR, some people I know for a fact will actually read your CV backwards and they'll look at the interests and voluntary last, because in some ways they often feel that can be a good icebreaker to warm up the meeting. And sometimes it can say whether there's a good, a sort of good harmony, not similarity, harmony between, what you do in your spare time and what you do as part of your course. So I think if you can keep that down to a maximum of 10 slides, that's really, really going to help. And I think, again, when you break down the sort of problem, is it sort of a real problem? How did you do the design, build, test? And I'm really stressing in real life, not on your mum and dad or your gran, someone who is really, a stranger to you and you're having to throw yourself in the deep end. And being honest, if it doesn't work, iterate it and go back in that loop. And does the user love it? And if the user loves it, then and only then should you go into the sexy CAD and renderings of the final hero shots. But don't do a hero shot and then go user test it and realize that they hate the red button being in that place and you've got to re-render it all over again. Or in many cases, students don't, and they just hope no one will notice. But it's weird. Deep down, good employers, good designers kind of see those cracks. So, examples when I was in your shoe. I'll go through this really fast because you can play it back slowly. Basically, sort of showing how I'd edit my folio, put the name and the role there, assume that people too long didn't read, contents page, depth. I did 5 slides on working with the NHS. Breadth, I did a bunch of small projects, which had all these different sort of ranges, as I mentioned earlier. And diversity, showing a bit of interest. And sure as shot, someone will have been like, hey, so you were in Norway? Or, oh, I did a thing with bottle rockets with my kid the other week. And it just really helps as an icebreaker. And so finally, give things a go. Year in Norway, forgive me if I told this story and you've heard it already, but essentially, I ended up wanting to go to Norway. It was only for the best in class. I knew my grades weren't going to be any good. But I applied anyway. It turned out later that a lot of people must have either been not interested or a little bit worried. And actually, my tutor said, well, you got the place. And I said, but how? And he said, well, there was 2 places and only 2 of you applied. And so I think, for me, that was quite a sort of formative lesson in not necessarily giving up just because, the chances are slim. But there was nothing to lose in applying. So I think as well, I sort of mentioned a little trick I had of sort of in town next Friday, probably in London it's now more Thursday, and saying, I'm doing some business stuff in the morning. Do you have time for a coffee or a pint in the afternoon? I've got the train tickets anyway, or I'm coming over. And sometimes just that slight sort of sense of inevitability can, get you a foot in the door to say, look, can I just have 15 minutes or 20 minutes? Don't take too much time. And obviously, if you have a bit of an agenda of what you'd like to talk about, that can be a great foot in the door. And then to finish the story, once I had that, the business was fake, but I just booked the tickets and go see that company in particular. Or indeed, try and do that with a couple of companies and genuinely see, get a few sort of informal interviews in one day. And so ISDA, if you haven't made note of it, definitely go check it out if it's still running. It's a great thing if you've got no experience, because it's one of the few ways you can get on the ladder with no previous industry experience. And I'd really say don't play safe. That would be a big thing. The really cool jobs don't go to safe candidates. And I think take meaningful, compassionate risks. I'm not saying move fast and break stuff a la Mark Zuckerberg, but, take something that makes sense and feels right with your ethics. And stuff that's bigger than you alone. If when you're going around design shows, as I have done recruiting, if you had a penny for everyone who's doing a pet project where you go, that's great, I can see that you're really into, whatever, and bongo drums but it just looks like those bongo drums are only designed for you. They're not designed for anyone other than yourself, so that's not really pushing you to a limit of empathy. And I think that, for me, is key in the graduate work. Of course, if you end up saying, I ended up becoming an entrepreneur making the best bongo drums in the world, it will never still be wasted, you having that empathy to look beyond yourself. So I think even if you know what you want to do with your life, your final year project should always go beyond yourself. I really haven't seen a good defense to do otherwise. So know what you do, and I think I sort of said push the button. So I hope that works out for you, and hope that's useful. And any feedback would be great. Please put comments in below, and I'll try and reply to them. Or if they're extremely intricate or personal, then feel free to send me a direct message either on Twitter, or my email address is on my website. Okay, hope that's useful. Thanks a lot. Bye.